So this week we have Dr. Hans-Joachim Heintze with us to teach our course on international law and human rights. So first question, how has international law aided in managing conflicts and keeping peace?
We have quite a developed system of international regulations, and the focus of those regulations is the peace issue, and therefore we as peace defenders and as human rights defenders, we have to know about the legal regulations. That's a starting point for our common struggle to improve the situation of the human beings and of the relations between countries. The precondition is knowledge. Second step is let's apply those regulations, and therefore it's an important part of the master program to deal with the basic rules of international law.
Mm-hmm. And what are the gaps in international law that you think must be addressed in order to strengthen peace and prevent conflict?
It seems to me the regulations are quite good. However, one of the problems is that there is no mechanism of enforcement of all the rules of international law. That's a certain weakness of international law in comparison with domestic law. I mean, we do not have any international police, no international prosecutors, and that means a precondition for the implementation is that the public opinion, that the non-state actors are aware of those obligations and put some pressure on politics to act in accordance with the obligations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from what we've discussed, we see that international bodies are slow to respond and come to a consensus, and it's undeniable that politics plays a heavy role, like very heavily influences international law and human rights. So, and also bodies like the UN, they pass resolutions that aren't enforceable, they're non-binding. So, as peace builders, how much faith do you think we should put in international law to step in and assist in violent conflicts?
Yeah, but the problem is we have nowadays at least 193 countries. And that means the countries have to come to and consent to form a new rules. And they have also to come to a consent concerning the implementation of rules. And therefore, it's not very surprising that in the light of the 193 countries, the implementation of the law is complicated. The 993 countries are sovereign entities, and that means sovereignty is quite a strong point to be made if you want to implement something which is in the interest of the majority of the countries. That means we all know in our private relations how complicated it is to come to a consent among, let's say, among such a group like our students. It's even more complicated talking about sovereign entities and talking about this huge number of countries. However, I mean, all the countries agree we do need some regulations, and all the countries agree, okay, let's implement those regulations because they are in interest of a peaceful relations of the countries. And therefore, I think, yes, in principle, everybody agrees. However, in detail, the situation is very often much more complicated, and therefore we cannot leave the implementation of international law only to states. No, we are citizens of countries, we form the civil society, and we have to know those rules because we have to argue with our politicians, please do the best to implement those rules. Those rules are good, those rules are useful, those rules are contained, for instance, the Charter of the United Nations, which is binding to all 193 countries. Therefore, yes, we are actors in the international relations, and we have power. And therefore, first step is knowledge, second step is to demand something, And our program is a program to inform people and to enable people to act in accordance with international regulations and to be part of the whole international system.
The topic of minority rights and also self-determination is very important as minorities struggle all over the world. Uyghurs in China, homosexuals in Russia, Christians in Egypt, and even Kurds in Turkey. So to what extent would you say the minorities' inability to freely express themselves, or the inability of the state to help minorities express themselves, to what extent is that causing conflicts in the countries?
Yeah. I mean, in the past, there was a strong approach of the international community to avoid to talk about minority rights, because yes, there was a fear that minority rights destabilize countries. But I think that's not true. The countries should realize that it's a huge value of the countries to be formed out of different groups, and all the groups contribute to the identity of the country, contribute to the culture of the country, and they should see it as an advantage. And as long as countries treat minority in accordance with human rights law, it seems to me the minorities are also loyal to their governments, and therefore let's find a way to implement human rights as a starting point for the countries to enjoy the advantages of minorities. One should not see it as a threat to the national unity, because if minorities are treated in the correct way, then they have no reasons, they have no ground to fight against governments. Therefore, it's the other way around, it's an advantage. Let's make use out of that advantage, and let's have some rules that the minorities can be sure that they can enjoy their culture, their language, their religion, and that the countries can be sure, yes, the minorities support the development of the country, are not a threat for the peaceful development of societies.
And last question, when the concept of human rights first arose, the intent was preventing the state from interfering in people's private lives, and then the human rights concept shifted to mandating the state to provide for its people, such as the right education and other social services. So how do you see the concept of human rights and international law shifting in the coming future to deal with the changing times?
Yeah, that's true. There are some scholars who identify 3 different generations of human rights. The traditional approach was, okay, civil and political rights, the first generation. And the traditional generation, we all know that generation from the French Declaration of Independence. The second step was, okay, it's not only an entitlement to defend the interference of the state into private affairs, it's also more that the state has to do something to enable people to enjoy human rights. And that means, yeah, the right to education, that's a starting point for applying human rights and for implementing human rights. Therefore, we have a second category of human rights, the second generation. That's the generation in which the states are obliged to do something in the field of social, educational, and cultural rights. And now the third generation are so-called rights of solidarity. I mean, we realize that the international community has to live together. However, it's very complicated to live together if there are such differences between the countries and between the groups in the countries. That means, for instance, the right to development. That's a new generation of human rights which enables states, societies, and the individual to enjoy all the other human rights, because if you are not developed, if you have no knowledge, and if you have no opportunity to fight for your rights, okay, then human rights do not mean anything. And therefore, yes, we have generations, we have a development, and it seems to me the development is quite convincing, because it's not any longer only the task of the state to fight for human rights. No, now we have a strong civil society, and the civil society is aware of the state obligations, and they claim it. And therefore, the civil society is a strong movement transforming the human rights issue on another level, the level of the involvement of the population in the implementation. And therefore, we need such programs, such master programs, to spread knowledge about the obligation of the countries and to enable the civil society to claim something on the basis of existing law. And this experience here in Turkey is quite encouraging, because it was a very interesting group, it was a very good atmosphere, and people were ready to learn, people were ready to participate. And I think that's our common future, that different nations with a different background come together to talk about the better implementation of human rights law and of international law.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Again, we have Hans-Joachim Heintze, who's the professor of international law and the director of Network of Humanitarian Action for Germany. Thank you so much.
Thanks.